So the first thing we were going to do before we get talking about the compromises in gender critical activism is say that many of us have just been watching the Standing for Women meeting in Dublin and how great it was. So let's maybe Zan and then Maya, if you say what you thought about it.
Yeah, I just caught the tail end of it, and I was just so impressed with the speakers and just the turnout. It was just wonderful to see, and it made me think of the whole Let Women Speak international campaign, which started, I feel really honored to have been at the very first one in Los Angeles, of the international ones. So it was wonderful to see. And there was just a lot of Twitter activity going on as well about it. Maya, you had something to say about it too?
Yes. Hi, everyone, and thank you for inviting me. Yes, with Let Women Speak, I can never make it down to the rallies, so I always follow them. And it's just been absolutely amazing watching the support grow over the years. And I think earlier on Twitter, somebody took a photo of the street in Dublin filled with women and men on the Let Women Speak side. Just, you couldn't see the end of the people, just carried on. And on and on. And someone said, well, now it's really resembling a movement. And it was such a poignant, such a strong statement, because it really does. And I think many people have been commenting about, taking taxis to there and taxi drivers saying, oh, I hear people talk about it all the time and everyone thinks it's a lot of nonsense and things like that. So I think it's really something is happening, and it's wonderful to see. And I'm just so glad that the police have done their job and that everyone is safe, because that's always a real concern. So well done to everyone, and so many of us are there with them in spirit.
So how I didn't coerce her. I run the Twitter on WDI Twitter, which I guess is X now. And I saw this post from Maya, and I was quickly attracted to it. I see a lot of posts, obviously, and I can't read them all. And I was quickly attracted to it because I frankly, personally, wasn't aware of all of the concerns. And she made a very long, there was quite a thread about it. So I asked her to come on and talk about these concerns that she observed, some of which I wasn't aware of. And I'm sure there are others of you that are also not aware of them. We can't think of everything. And she has such a wonderfully acute sense of analysis and spends a lot of time thinking about things and talking about it. So I wanted to have her on once again and have her talk about her concerns.
We've been in all of this now for many years altogether, and a lot has been achieved. And, it's actually quite heartening thinking back to 2016 or 2017 and compare it to where we are now. Women have organized, we have gotten clued on to what was happening. The activism has become, much more effective, and we've made tremendous gains. I think obviously we haven't, achieved everything we wanted, but a lot has been achieved, and in no small part thanks to all the amazing women and all the amazing organizations that have, put aside their other projects and their other work in order to attend to this problem. So whenever I talk about these concerns, it is never to criticize anyone specifically. It is just something that I notice because I've got a bit of a long and complex life experience, and if you wish, I've seen things out of the best intentions be turned around, and I'm always quite on guard for things that can be pitfalls in the long run. So I think this is where my angle comes from, that I notice something and I go, ooh, or I notice something and then I see somebody offer a constructive criticism about it and I go, okay, well, that is a really good point. So I think now over the past, months and years, some of these concerns have crystallized for me. So I think, and as we tried to, I think we're all pretty desperate for this to end, we are all here to secure women's sex-based rights and to stop chemical castration of children and clinical abuse of gender non-conforming children. I think those are the two things that we can all broadly really agree on. So we are really desperate for it to be over. And I think in our desire to resolve things as quickly as possible, there might be some ideas that, perhaps should be more widely discussed. So if you'd like, I'll just go through the concerns that I've got, and then we can...
Yeah, I have a list here too, and I can just sort of introduce them, and then you can speak on them. Some of them I'm not as articulate on them as I would like to be. But the first one is transition. So the first concern you have is this transition is right for some children. So why should we be concerned about that?
Yeah, I mean, that is, as a doctor, obviously, more of these medical concerns are more of my remit and more of my concern. So for me, that is a big one. I think there is a tendency to want to find the middle ground with what is happening. But if you really connect with what is happening, the idea that transition is right for some children might seem reasonable on the surface, but you need to first consider what transition actually involves. So transition typically involves so-called social transition, where children, and some of them can be very, very young, I mean, we're talking 4 or 5 years old, are misled into believing that they can actually be the opposite sex via the validation of these opposite sex identities. So usage of opposite sex pronouns, changing to a name that is classically associated with the opposite sex, change of clothes and style and all that. So that social transition was flagged up in Cass' review, which is a review by a senior pediatrician in the UK that was commissioned by the NHS. And Hilary Cass has flagged it up as not a neutral act, because if you take young and impressionable children and you give them give the credence to the idea that even though they're a boy, they can be a girl, that's not a problem, they might come to believe it. And the reason why it's not a neutral act is because we have data dating back 30 years that shows us that if children are not validated in these opposite sex identities, and if they're just allowed to go through normal puberty, vast majority of them, I mean, up to something like 90%, will stop identifying as the opposite sex and simply grow up to be healthy, well-adjusted adults, often same-sex attracted or bisexual. So, however, with the social transition, in the milieu where this medical transition is not only encouraged, but mandated in many places in the world, children who are put on this path of social transition then progress onto medical transition. And medical transition basically involves blocking normal puberty, blocking normal pubertal development by using drugs that are effectively chemically castrating children at the onset of puberty. And then studies that we have so far, particularly from Tavistock in the UK, show that something like 98% of children who were on puberty blockers progress on to other treatments such as opposite sex hormones. So what this means is that boys will not be allowed to mature, their bodies will not develop, or sexually their bones and their cognitive development will be arrested at a pre-pubertal stage, and then they will be given feminizing doses of estrogen. So that means that their bodies will be then brought into severe hormonal imbalance. And then ditto for females, there will be, puberty blocked and then given testosterone. And then a significant proportion of these children, now adolescents, and then young adults, will progress onto surgeries which will be removing healthy body parts such as breasts on females. They will be removing testicles and penises on males. These are so-called gender-affirming surgeries. So if you look at it in that context, to say that entire process is right for some children, whilst we know that humans can't change sex. So you're not actually creating a boy out of a girl or a girl out of a boy. You are clinically abusing that child, and you are causing some very severe health problems in the long term for them. I think it is, you know, as much as we would like to find the middle ground, what are we exactly finding middle ground on? We're finding middle ground with clinical abuse of children, and that's not right. And it's also important to say that, you know, transition is right for some children presumes that some children are trans. And if you think about what is trans, you know, trans lobby will like you to believe that that means that there is some kind of neurobiological basis which tells us that someone's been born in the wrong body or that they have opposite sex brain. None of that. There is no evidence for it. Trans is simply a behavior, and often, almost always, it's a learned behavior. So for us to be saying that children deserve that kind of treatment and those consequences to their health and their psychological health as well, because they have, for some reason, and there are many reasons in a culture, including gender ideology being promoted heavily everywhere, including in schools, that they deserve that treatment simply because they've started emulating opposite sex. It just doesn't make any sense. So, you know, from where I'm coming from, there is no such thing as a trans child. There are some who are, for a variety of reasons, desire to be seen as the opposite sex or are led to, you know, motivated.
Yeah.
And that's why I think transition is right for some children is absolutely a wrong message to be giving anyone from our side, you know. So that is my concern really with regards to that. And but I think desire to find a middle ground.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. That's the challenge, is this middle ground that a lot of people, women in the movement and people in general want to sort of find, you know, and living in a democracies as we live, it's like, can't we find some kind of middle ground in that? But it's, as you pointed out, it's like, it's opening a Pandora's box. Once you know, you made the opening of the box really clear. What's happens once you start doing that? And we have many, many examples in our societies, in our modern society, postmodern society, of once you open the Pandora's box of whatever, it becomes just, it's out of control. Everything ends up being out of control on some level. I mean, you know, grocery stores used to not be open on Sundays. Now they're open. They're open 24/7, and that means that somebody has to work, you know, at 3 a.m. on a Sunday.
And I mean, this is exactly what you see with this transition may be right for some children. You're saying this is exactly the attitude from the clinicians who started this whole thing about 10 years ago. They were motivated primarily with helping adult males pass, quote unquote, better as women by preventing masculinization in puberty. And then they started doing this to children. And I think to begin with, they believe that that it is right for some children, because eventually some children will grow up into adults who will desire this to have been done to them. And as we saw, this is spiral out of control.
Yeah.
Within 5 years of that starting. So I think it's exactly right what you said. It's a slope, and it makes no sense to me.
Yeah. The next concern you had was about the quote of, we should be doing RCTs on puberty blockers. RCTs are controlled trials, reoccurring controlled trials on puberty blockers. And we shouldn't be doing those. We should be doing them on what?
Well, the randomized controlled trials basically are the panacea of medicine. You know, it's seen as one of the most robust way of testing an intervention. Is your researchers and your subjects don't exactly know whether they need a drug or a placebo, and then you're blinded both sides to what has been given, and then you study the outcomes without prejudice. So that's basically what randomized controlled trial is. And now I think it's a misguided attempt that's come from the analysis that existing trans research is of very low quality. The methodology is very poor. Follow-up, biases, confounding factors, and everything are just rife in that area. So I think one of the ideas was, okay, fine, if we can now get better research to show the outcomes. However, first of all, my concern is that these interventions have already been shown to be harmful, as we've just spoken about. This is chemical castration of children. So why should we be inflicting that on a new cohort just to get data? When we already have data, whether the conditions under which these children were giving these drugs was okay or not, whether data collection was adequate or not, they've been given it, and there is a lot of children who have already received it. So yes, these studies could have been constructed better, but you always need to keep an eye on not inflicting unnecessary harm, and this is unnecessary harm. So there is a different, there could have been a different approach to this. I should just say, as part of what came out of CAST review, and now we have the new service specifications. Nothing that we really hoped for has actually happened. We wanted to stop puberty blocker prescribing. We wanted to stop any new puberty blocker prescribing, and we wanted to stop any cross-sex hormone prescribing for children. The new service specifications are continuing to prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for children who are already on it. And they are now proposing new trials on puberty blockers, which means that there will be more children that are basically pulled into this. And instead, what I would have liked to see is a complete stop to this medicalization, and then assessing children individually, anyone who has been affected, assessing the damage that was done, and then following them up and seeing what interventions they needed. Because what we actually don't know is to which degree are these puberty blockers reversible, and for how long, there is a puberty window, and for how long these children needed to be on them before some really serious long-term side effects kicked in. So there is a lot of information that we could be studying without continuing to hurt children and without hurting any new children. And I think this data and looking at reversibility and what interventions are required to bring these children back into hormonal balance would be essential for the health of the transitioners. We already have a huge number of people desisting and stopping with these taking these medications, and they're they've got severe side effects and long-term effects on their health. Their hormonal health. Women are struggling with premature menopause. Men have very low testosterone and things like that. So this kind of data on reversibility, how long, what is needed, can actually help a growing cohort of people, young adults, who are now emerging. None of that is necessarily happening. The transitioners aren't necessarily front and center in this proposal in any way. So this is what I'm really concerned. And also because, as Hannah Barnes's book, A Time to Think, has flagged up, there are some very serious demographic characteristics of children who are overrepresented in this cohort, and many of them come from dysfunctional families. They are children in care. They have multiple psychological problems and things like that. So when in the situation where there is growing awareness about the danger of these interventions, you have to ask yourself which children are going to be enrolled. It's going to be children who are more vulnerable, who have less oversight, maybe no parents or parents who would advocate for them. So there is another ethical problem there that this may now end up affecting the most vulnerable children as well. And I think that is a complete opposite from what we should be doing.
Right. Then you talk about the push for sex inaccurate language, and well, you mentioned that in your tweet, on euphemisms for medical surgery, all of the the lingo, gender affirmation, and how it minimizes the harms of sex inaccurate language. Here at WDI, I mean, I'm very clear about the language thing. I think that's the first thing. I even have a challenge. I'm challenged to even use the word trans. I do the Dansky thing, because just because. So could you talk about that, the sex inaccurate language issue and the euphemisms that still are they're still around. We see them. I see them on Twitter all the time.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a really big one from the very beginning. There's always been, I think as the activism evolved, the awareness of the importance of using accurate sex language has grown, because it has been promoted as simply a kindness to people who have quote unquote gender incongruence. And, there is a lot of, history of using wrong sex pronouns for people within LGB activism, particularly drag and things like that. So it's not new. And however, it absolutely underpins the success of this ideology. Using a she for a man has resulted in, I'm sure most listeners already know, but men in women's prisons, men on women's hospital wards, men in women's toilet, men in women's sport. And if you try to argue that she, quote unquote, shouldn't be competing with women, you're not going to get anywhere if you validate that lie. Also, from that lie, we got self-ID, which means that any man can now say, I'm a woman, you need to call me by a woman's name and use she, her pronouns, and that is then used in reporting. So you have media stories about female rapists and female pedophiles, which are of course men. And it also has, gotten so embedded into our institutions that now this sex secrecy, which has ensued simply by a man saying, I'm a woman, call me by a female name and female pronouns, we can't even, we have this thing called DBS checks in the UK where, if you're going to work with vulnerable people, children or adults, you need to be checked for whether you've got a criminal record and things like that. All of these things are now basically rendered non-functional, because anyone who has declared the opposite sex identity and demanded to be referred to as the opposite sex in language is basically their sex and their data is being completely concealed. Medical records are the same. You say, I'm a woman, but I say I'm a man, I get a new medical record and all you're ever going to see is male. You're going to be looking at me, but if you don't see me, you're going to think that you're talking about an actual man. So there is a lot of, particularly with pronouns, a lot of damage that it has done. And I think also the euphemisms for, some of the more damaging things, like for example, transition. It's not a transition, it is inducing iatrogenic harm in a vain attempt to change somebody's sex or to make them look like the opposite sex. It's not top surgery, it is an unnecessary double mastectomy on a psychologically distressed person, often a child. So these euphemisms serve to minimize, to distance people from what is really happening. It all sounds very pleasant and non-confrontational, and you can just distance yourself from the reality of it. And I think it's also very powerful in making children feel that if they want to go down that route, it's really no big deal. Oh, I'm just going to get a bit of a top surgery, and now you're calling me Leo, I'm a he, him, everything is. By the time that poor girl is 25 and, her health is in a really bad place, no one really wants to know, because that's now possibly a detransitioner or a harmed transitioner. So I think in all of this, you now have portrayal of women who, in my opinion, rightfully keep pointing out that we cannot compromise on language. We have to be crystal clear because it is essential for what we are trying to achieve. Those women are presented as extremists, and often they're presented as extremists so that those who are willing to make these concessions can say, but you see, we are not like those extremists over there, so please negotiate with us because we're going to be more reasonable. And you're just getting this slow creep into something that is not going to really end all that well for what we're trying to achieve when you combine it with all the rest of what is happening. So
yeah.
That would be
I think it was, I just read a Kelly J just pointed out, I think that's where I read it or heard it just right before the webinar, that the trans activists haven't budged an inch on any of their on any of what we're trying to get across. They haven't budged an inch in all of these years, and so this idea of compromise by sort of playing along with the language thing, it's hogwash, it's poo-poo. Let me move on, though, to the next point, because I think it's also relevant. Amending the Equalities Act 2010 to clarify sex referring to biological sex may have unintended consequences. You say that there may be alternatives that could do a better job. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so in the UK, we have the Equality Act, which covers, protected characteristics on the basis of which a person cannot be discriminated against lawfully. And one of these characteristics is sex. And there are also now exemptions to that say that for the purposes of the Act, single-sex provisions, if they are necessary, for example, women-only wards or women-only health services and things like that, it is then permissible to discriminate on the basis of sex, as in to exclude males. Now, because these trans activists have had years of basically unlimited access to politicians and institutions, that have managed to convince them convince them into things that are not really lawful. For example, they misled everyone to believe that it's not legal to exclude a man as long as he identifies as a woman. So this is where we now have an issue, with regards to women's single-sex wards and prison accommodation, things like that. So the main issue here is that I think yet another example of a really good idea that I initially, supported and thought, well, this is brilliant. However, it was flagged up that Equality Act already very clearly defines men, women, boys and girls. It says quite clearly that a man is a male of any age and that a woman is a female of any age. So that's the Equality Act definition of sex. And single-sex exemptions make absolutely no allowance for people who hold these gender recognition certificates. That is to say that people who have these sex falsification documents are still can be excluded from opposite-sex services, even if they identify as the opposite sex. So that is quite clear in the Act already. The Act does, under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment, does mention reassigning of the person's sex. So that is perhaps a problematic wording, but nowhere else in the Act is it not clear that sex is in fact biological sex, because male and female are biological categories. Now, the proposed amendment wishes to change that original definition of man is a male of any age, woman is a female of any age, into now going into detail that a man is anyone who is born male, even if they acquired the opposite sex via gender recognition certificates. So that is now complicating what is essentially a very simple definition, and it's introducing two types of sex: biological sex and so-called legal sex. And the unintended consequence of this can be that there is many laws in our country that refer to sex, that don't clarify now whether it is going to be a legal sex or biological sex. You're now actually affecting the rest of the legislation by changing that particular wording. And what could be potentially a better, approach would be to perhaps change the wording under the protected characteristic of gender reassignment to say that it is the person's gender that is being reassigned rather than person's sex. And then we can talk about what gender means, and let's now define gender in law, blah, blah, if we want to. Or perhaps to remove protected characteristic of gender reassignment altogether and put it under religion or belief, because there is no real reality to it. There's just people who believe they're the opposite sex. I mean, that's a bit of a more radical approach. And ultimately, what we really do need is to repeal Gender Recognition Act, because it is a sex falsification law that embeds secrecy around the falsification of sex. And as long as it is in place, it will make any sex-based rights impossible to ensure, because there's always going to be people with documents that are stating falsities, and it's going to be up to frontline staff to now say, no, I'm sorry, you don't pass as a woman. And then you have an angry trans-identifying male having a problem with that and suing the service, and all kinds of other outcomes can be anticipated, including people just refusing to provide single-sex services, because Equality Act does not compel anyone to provide a single-sex service. It only makes it lawful, if you see what I mean. So if it becomes too risky for people to provide that service, then they will just not provide it, and that's going to be legal as well, and we're just going to end up in even more of an issue. So I just wanted to kind of use Maya Forstater judgment as an example of slightly unintended consequence. It was one of the most important judgments in entire gender critical activism in the UK, and its importance cannot be underestimated. But as soon as the strategy was announced to argue on the basis of gender critical beliefs, there were concerns in the community, people saying, well, why are we relegating stating simple scientific facts to a belief? And we were all reassured that it is the best way to argue for this. And perhaps it definitely was. Clearly, the judgment was successful for us and the appeal was successful. However, what happened there is that gender critical beliefs, which are simply, that's a terminology for people's right to state obvious facts of sex in humans, was equated to gender ideology beliefs. So they are now both beliefs and they are equal. And it was only gender critical beliefs that were interrogated in court, because previously Maya Forstater was, the judgment that she appealed against was the judgment that stated that her right to say that sex can't be changed is not worthy of respect in a democratic society, quote unquote. So this is what needed to be overturned. And even though she was successful, what you ended up with is that gender ideology, her right to state biological facts, i.e. her right to hold so-called gender critical beliefs, was deemed to be worthy of respect in democratic society. But at the same time, so was gender identity ideology, right, without being actually interrogated. And in the judgment, because of this equating of the two, the judgment concluded, well, no, but for me, what stuck in my mind was that it was still said that you cannot misgender people with impunity, which means that if there is still compelled speech, there is still compelled, etc. So even though this was a really important judgment, and perhaps that was the best way to argue for it, there was a slight unintended consequence to it. Yeah. So even with a resounding success, we just need to now, consider that the trans lobby is so strong and the institutions are so captured, even a slight loophole will be exploited. So yeah, that's for me why I think it's very important to just be super careful if we're going to meddle in legislation or try to amend anything, just to kind of hear out all the concerns and just make sure that we don't end up, perhaps making things worse.
Yeah, and I mean, what it brings to the fore for me is just how utterly complex all of this is. And for the vast majority of people in the world, and let's just say the Western world, it's overwhelmingly complicated and difficult to follow and understand. And it's not a high priority for a lot of people. Let's face it, until they're confronted with it, personally. And maybe that is going to be part of one of the tipping points, is as people become more and more familiar with these issues from a personal experience, then it gets transformed into some kind of larger movement that has some political clout that we're gaining little by little. But still, we're far from, I think, our goal. View also, and some of the ways that gets manifested are in the way that, things you've also articulated in terms of the idea of having access to sex aggregated spaces, that they should be based on appearance, how masculine or feminine does somebody look rather than their biological sex, or that, female sport is for anyone who didn't go through male puberty. These are all the same kinds of we want to have some solutions. We want to compromise, but these all have all of these, they're compromises that don't really work in the long run. There's too many loopholes, like you said.
Well, yeah, I mean, with regards to access to sex segregated spaces, I think this is exactly what we have now. We have access based on opinion. It's just that who is going to be the judge of whether somebody passes or not, you know? And right now, the judge is, you know, trans lobby who have captured institutions ideologically and policy-wise, and you basically have a man with a scrunchie in his head shouting at a woman, claiming that he's to a woman, so good luck ejecting him. I think there is a valid concern about, you know, some women worry about women who have undertaken steps to really go as far as possible to masculinize their appearance. And you do see these women with beards and big muscles, and, you know, on the photos, they look very convincingly male. But in real life, often you find that they're quite short and small and have female body habitus. So it's slightly different when you see them on pictures versus in real life. But yes, some women have, you know, the so-called trans men have taken severe steps to appear male. And in the situation where we are now, women are becoming, rightly so, paranoid about the presence of men in women's spaces. You know, we cannot just disregard the concerns that some women have of encountering such a woman and then perhaps not being able to tell whether it's a woman or a man, and it is quite distressing. And this is, I think, where this whole idea of accessing spaces on the basis of appearance comes from. But there are two issues with that. First issue is that sex segregated spaces are not 100%, you know, they're not compulsory. So if a woman has masculinized herself and identifies as a man, she can and often does use opposite sex spaces like loos or what have you. And the second is that if you are going to eject masculinized women, you have to accept feminized men. And this is where we are at the moment. So I think there needs to be, you know, an acknowledgement that women, even if they are masculinized, may need to use women's single-sex spaces, you know, they for safety or for healthcare and things like that. We cannot, in my opinion, justifiably bar women who have masculinize themselves via these treatments from female-only spaces. We should have some kind of way of that women can trust that masculinized woman is indeed female. So, you know, now there are different ideas that I've seen around, including, you know, ID cards that can be issued by organizations that still have data integrity. In the UK, it seems to be connected to a national insurance number that they still keep. They're the ones who are able to authenticate whether somebody is indeed male or female, regardless of their GRC, because they keep records from the very beginning. I think you get an NI number here when you're 16. So that is one of the unadulterated data trails, is that a national insurance number data that they hold on everyone. So, you know, I don't necessarily have all the solutions and all the answers, but it is certainly something that we need to debate and discuss and find a better way, in my opinion, than just saying access based on appearance, because then we are, you know, basically where we are now, and we are letting down a lot of women and girls who, you know, also need same.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I didn't consider the woman who's calls herself a man side of it. And I don't know what I think about that. I mean, I kind of feel like it's a contradiction, you know, if you're gonna say it's, you know, yeah, I find it a contradiction, or maybe not. It's just, it's one of those confusing things. I tend to sort of intuitively, when I see a woman who's takes hormones, I kind of can identify them pretty quickly. I mean, they don't really ever look like real men, but yeah, but I think for me, and I'm sure I speak for others as well, is that you know, why do we as individuals have to do the policing? You know what I mean? You know, and I'm a pretty rowdy. I can confront people, but I don't want to do it all the time. That's what gets me incredibly angry, is that these issues are are put upon our shoulders as individuals rather than the state and laws being passed to police and care for. There is a real neglect, a social neglect, I find, that comes with all this that is disheartening. How are we on time, Joe? I don't have a clock in front of me.
Right. We are coming to the end, so you've got about 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Okay. And just for people to know that Maja Bowen is going to come to the breakout rooms, so you can talk to her there, and she will put her camera on in the breakout rooms, so we could carry on in the breakout rooms. But you've got about 5 minutes now. Okay.
Let me skip to the one on the bottom that I think is interesting, that I'm not so familiar with, which is you're concerned about signing up to pledges and initiatives by trans activist organizations in order to appease them. What is going on there? What that you're concerned about?
Well, it's just that is more of a minor concern, I would say, that I've just sort of seen recently. There was again trying to meet in the middle, trying to find common ground, and there was some initiative for signing a relationship and sex education pledge by a trans activist organization called Brooke. And when you read the pledge, it sounds pretty sensible, but when you look at the Brooke website, they actually promote sex falsification, they promote puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors, they repeat misleading information about reversibility of these interventions. So in effect, it's why do we need to do that? Can we not just come up with our own pledges and our own, things, and find organizations that might not be quite so dedicated to trans ideology? Because otherwise, by wanting to find the common ground, in a way, we're bolstering everything else that they're standing for. And there was just one more thing that I wanted to mention before the end, is just one thing that really concerns me is this tendency to say male people and female people instead of men, women, boys, and girls, and saying young people instead of children. This male people, female people doesn't distinguish between adults and children. And because this ideology is so fixated on adultification of children and erasure of the boundary between adults and children, I think it is actually essential that we talk about men, women, boys, and girls, even if that might make things a bit more uncomfortable with regards to describing trans identifying people.
Oh, one other thing too that we talked about before we went on air. The politically the growing focus on detransitioners and trans, what are called trans widows. Is there some kind of, should we be, how much attention politically should we be attending to them? And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think with regards to detransitioners, I think, unfortunately, they more often become a resource than people who get help from our community. I think it's completely reasonable to expect people who have been through it all to share their stories and try to help everyone else get insights into how to stop other children going down the same path. But I'm acutely aware that detransitioners have a lot of need for support, for counseling, for job support, for health support, and all that kind of stuff. And at the same time, I'm seeing them trying to do so much for others that I'm growing slightly concerned about us. Perhaps we should focus more on securing resources for these people rather than asking them to do something for us. And with regards to trans widows, I think these women have seen in their own homes, in their own lives, the absolute destructiveness of adherents and people who are possibly pushing this ideology, which are autogynephilic men. So I think their stories are uncomfortable, they're confronting, and particularly they're confronting for people who wish to find middle ground and try to mollify the opposite side. And I think they're also often disregarded and not listened to and presented as some kind of extremists. What I would like to see is I would like to see them front and center. So I would like us to look after those who have been most affected by this, and they are children and wives of men who transition, or even women who transition. You have in lesbian relationships also situations do happen, and then also us to, as a community, put some thought and effort into providing help for the transitioners.
So this is the book that was written in 2022 by our previous speaker, Dr Maja Bowen, and it's in the name of Isidora Sanger, Born in the Right Body, Gender Identity Ideology from Medical and Feminist Perspective, and it's available in a wide range of places. And that so that's something, if you want to follow up on some of these ideas, you could do that. And then we also have another book coming up that I want to show you about, is a WDI book, which is coming. There's going to be a launch on the 13th of October. It's called Women's Rights, Gender Wrongs, the impact of the global impact of gender identity ideology. Editors Kath Aiken and Sally Wainwright. And there are 35 country reports. They detail the progress and setbacks for women's sex-based rights as set up by the UN and reiterated by our Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. And there are also writers, chapters, not just country reports, but also impacts on different countries and theoretical pieces as well. So you can go to the launch, tickettailor.com here, and we'll keep on promoting it in the webinars.